I'm delighted to see such a good turnout. This is wonderful. My name is Greg Borzo. I'm the program chair of Midland Authors, and that's an organization that gets readers and authors together to celebrate books. We're very, very fortunate to meet here in this auditorium at the Chicago Public Library. So I want to thank the library for hosting us. Beautiful venue. I'm going to jump right ahead, not to waste any time, because we have so many people, 4 on the panel, all mystery writers, all memoirists, jumping ahead to February. And so I'm just going to turn the panel over to our moderator, David Berner. David is a Chicago writer, journalist, and teacher. He's the author of several books, including 5 works of memoir. He's been honored as a writer in residence at both the Jack Kerouac Project in Orlando, Florida, and also at the Ernest Hemingway Birthplace and Museum in Oak Park. David's books have been honored by Chicago Writers Association, Eric Hoffer Book Awards, and others, including the Midland Authors. David's novel, called A Well-Respected Man, was a 2019 finalist in the fiction category at the Midland Authors Book Awards. And yes, we have a Book Awards program. Those books are announced, the winners are announced, celebrated at a big banquet in May. Go to our website to learn more about that program and all of our events. But back to tonight's program. David is an anchor and a reporter at WBBM News Radio, and he's an associate professor at Columbia College. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you. Everybody looks really good tonight, dressed up for the event, right? Appreciate you being here very much. Thank you, Greg, for asking us to be here for this and to ask me to moderate. It's an honor to be with the folks that we're going to be with tonight, the writers who have really sunk their lives, literally, into these books. So I'm going to just act like the conduit here. We'll talk a little bit about my book, but really we're going to focus on the idea of memoir, what it is, why we even bother writing them, and how to do that. Maybe a little bit about how to get to that place where you think you have something that would be considered a memoir. There are 4 of us here. There's a mystery person over there. Margaret Mullen is running late because of O'Hare, which doesn't surprise anybody. So hopefully she will be here at some point, and she'll make a grand entrance, and we'll make a big deal out of it, and we'll bring her up here, and we'll move on from there. So we'll try to keep it loosey-goosey. The first thing I wanted to do, and I want to take a moment with this before we get right into the discussion, is that there's always this, if you sit with literary people all the time, the question is, what is memoir? What really is memoir? What is it about? Well, we know, for most of us who write it, know that it's not autobiography. That's something different. That's entire life. Memoir is a sliver of that life, or a portion, or a thematic part of that life. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that it is the universal thread that connects us to the rest of humanity. And by doing this, by writing one, it turns our small personal sorrows and our individual tragedies or triumphs and longings into art. Hopefully we have done a little of that. Marion Roach Smith, the author of Another Name for Madness, about her mother's Alzheimer's, says it's not about you. We hear that a lot about memoir. Memoir is about something you know after something you have been through. So hopefully we're going to touch a little bit on that with the authors that are up here. Let me introduce you to them. First of all, directly to my left here is Richard Lindbergh. Richard is a past president of the Society of Midland Authors, a Chicago historian, and author of 20 published volumes. 2011 memoir, Whiskey Breakfast, My Swedish Family, My American Life, published by the University of Minnesota Press, represented 22 years of research and writing into his immigrant family, torn apart by poverty, alcoholism, divorce, dark secrets, and a 60-year-old mystery Richard uncovered in his work on this book. It is a multi-generational saga and intensely personal. In 2012, the Chicago Writers Association named it the Nonfiction Book of the Year. Welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
And Donna Urbicus. Donna was a finalist for the Chicago Writers Association Book Awards, Society of Midland Authors Book Awards, the Midwest Book Awards, bronze winner of the Forward Indies, graduate of the University of Illinois in biology, the Illinois Institute of Technology in Environmental Engineering, has been a high school teacher. Her memoir, My Sister's Mother, a memoir of war, exile, and Stalin's Siberia. The story of her Polish-born mother and half-sister and how they endured dehumanizing conditions during World War II as slave laborers in Siberia. War and exile created a profound bond between mother and older daughter, one that Donna would struggle to find with either of them. The book has been called a searing tale of war, trauma, and survival, a gripping study of family dynamics. Thank you for being here. We'll talk about Margaret's book when she shows up, when she gets here. My book is called The Consequence of Stars. It's a little bit different than the kinds of memoirs that the three of these writers have written. Mine is a memoir in essays. It's all about the concept of home and what home is about, what it means to us, why do we search for it, why do we feel good when we find it, what is it, physical, metaphorical, what is home? So it's a story related to my family, related to my life, but it's really about that concept. So that's quite different than what you've heard about, and we want to talk about those differences a little bit. But first of all, what I really hope to talk about, and I'm going to have a seat now if you don't mind. What we really want to talk about, we're going to do three things. One is what. So what is your book? Tell us a little bit about how you got to the place that you wrote it, maybe a little more in depth than I discussed at the beginning here. And then the why. Why did you bother writing it? Why do this? Why sink yourself into your secrets of a life, of issues that are difficult to deal with? And then maybe a little bit about how to accomplish this kind of thing. Where do you start? How do you begin? How do you know that you have a narrative of some kind that might work as a successful memoir? So I want to talk a little bit about your books. So Donna, you want to tell us a little bit about your book, first of all, a little bit more in depth about what it's all about.
Okay, is this on?
I think it is.
Hello?
You hear her okay?
Can you hear me? Yeah, oh, great. So my book entitled My Sister's Mother came out of really my looking back at my life with my mother, who would never stop talking about World War II stuff that happened to her. And it really was a long effort. I started it when my first child was born, which was, I hate to say this, 36 years ago. But anyway, so let me just kind of tell you a little bit about that. It has gotten a lot of recognition, which I'm very grateful for, because my background is not writing. I basically took myself on a writing tour and workshops and various writers' conferences, and there's one coming up here with the Chicago Writers Association soon, and certainly Midland Authors has various workshops which are important. Because my background is really science and engineering, so I had to kind of learn this process, but I've always wanted to be a writer, so I embarked on this story. It's really two different stories. It's the World War II story of what happened to my mother and sister and my father, and it's also me growing up with that story. So my challenge in writing the book was, how do I put the two together? First of all, I had to answer the question, like, whose memoir is this? Is it my mother and sister, who are pictured in England before I was born, and is also the cover of the book, or is it my story with my mother where I had a very different relationship with my mother than my sister had with, my half-sister had with our mother? So that was, first of all, a challenge for me, because I started out writing it just as the World War II story. I was not interested in writing anything about myself. In fact, I went kicking and screaming about having been told many times to put myself into the story. To give some background here, one of the things that you really have to know about Poland and its history is instrumental to the story that I write about. This is something that I try to educate people on all the time. The partition of Poland, this is Poland during before World War II, and this graphic is from my friend Wesley Adamczyk, who also wrote about his experiences as a child being deported in his really good book. And I bring this up because now, dear Mr. Putin is trying to say that Russia did not invade Poland, that they, quote, liberated Poland, and that the war really only started in 1941. Well, that's not true. And this is part of one reason that I wrote the book, was to educate people on communism and what happened during that time. And here is a headline from the Chicago Sunday Tribune from that invasion that happened 2 weeks after Hitler invaded Poland. Here's another thing that's part of this unknown, not well-known history, which affected my father. He was captured at the start of the war, and he was sent to a prisoner of war camp. He was an officer, and he narrowly escaped being one of the more than 20,000 officers and other intellectuals who were murdered by the Soviets, who were blaming the Germans at the time. And it's collectively called the Katyn Forest Massacres. This memorial is in New Jersey, which I think very well depicts that particular part of history, which is another thing that I try to tell people about. This is the map of my parents' journey, starting in Poland and going all through the Soviet Union, Siberia. My mother ended up in India. My father fought with the Second Polish Corps, which was part of the British Army during World War II, and they both ended up in England and met there again, because they had met a couple of times in that journey, and that's where I was born. So just to kind of reiterate what David is saying, like, what is memoir? One of my favorite authors, and she's very well known, Vivian Gornick, wrote The Situation and the Story, that a memoir is a work of sustained narrative prose controlled by an idea of self, under obligation to lift from the raw material of life a tale that will shape, experience, transform, event, and deliver wisdom. I think that really tells a lot about what memoir is. Mary Karr, in her Art of the Memoir, says, in some ways, writing a memoir is knocking yourself out with your own fist if it's done right. And then, as David was pointing out, memoir is not autobiography. Autobiography is the story of life, whereas memoir is the story from life. And this comes from Judith Barrington in her book, Writing the Memoir from Truth to Art. So, why write a memoir? Well, who cares? And why did I care? Well, here's some reasons. To make sense of a strong but vexing relationship. I had a very bad relationship with my mother because she was not letting go of World War II, and it was filtering into her and my everyday life. To uncover all that was not being said, there were some family secrets in there that, I was kind of thinking about and, never really told. To penetrate the familiar and make some sense of it, yeah. To tell a tale of an unlived relationship, like what kind of mother would my mother been had she not gone through all of that? What kind of mother would I have been if I hadn't have that mother and that experience with her?
Can I, I'm sorry to interrupt you for a moment, but I thought we'd hang on to the why just for a moment, because it'd be a good time to bring Margaret in and talk a little bit more about each other's books, and we can get into the why.
Oh, I thought you wanted me to keep going.
Yeah, no, that's fine at all. Margaret, you've made this incredible entrance, Everyone, this is Margaret McMullen. Can I tell them a little bit about you while you're getting settled in? Yeah, okay. Margaret is a recipient of a National Education Association Fellowship in Literature, a Fulbright, the National Author winner of the 2011 Eugene and Maryland Glick Indiana Authors Award. Margaret McMullen is the author of 9 award-winning books, including the new memoir, Where the Angels Lived, one family story of loss, exile, and return. And in it, she discovers the existence of a long-lost relative at Israel's Holocaust Museum. And this begins her quest to uncover the forgotten history of her ancestors. Part of the story is what Margaret dealt with in the dealings of this, because Soviet-style bureaucracy still exists, skepticism, anti-Semitism, and the same sort of isolation and rejection Macmillan's Jewish-Hungarian family experienced in 1844 became what she was dealing with, trying to get to the bottom of this story. So again, Margaret, thanks for being here. Oh, no, that we understand. You came from O'Hare, so believe me, everyone here knows. So what we were trying to do is tell a little bit about what, and then why, and then how. So if you want to expand a little bit while you've come in, and I've already introduced you, maybe a little bit more about what your memoir is about and how you got to the place of writing it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Want to pull that mic a little closer to yourself?
Yes. Thank you so much. So, how do I start with my little PowerPoint?
You can do
or?
whatever you can. We want to try to stay on the theme of what, like what is the book about?
Forget
Let's do
the
that
PowerPoint.
first. Yeah.
So, I took a trip to Israel as a part of a writers' gathering in a couple of years ago, and there was a day set aside for the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, and I took that opportunity to go to the archives, to the library there, and look up my mother's maiden name. Now, I thought I knew all about my mother, but it's hard to know all about my mother because she was trained to keep secrets. She was born to keep secrets. She was born in Vienna, and her father was Jewish, converted to Catholicism in 1938, and basically trained his daughter not to talk while they slowly figured out ways to get out after Hitler came in. She saw Hitler at the dentist's office while she was having her cavities filled. That was the day of the Anschluss, and he came in, and there was a parade, and she clapped alongside everybody else, thinking, "Yay, I don't have to have my cavities filled." So it was she had an extraordinary life, and I've always thought she's one of the most interesting people I know. And but she also worked for the CIA, which helped her even more not to lie, but to withhold information that was only on a need-to-know basis. So I wrote about her life in a fictional way in a novel called In My Mother's House. And when I was researching and writing that book, Yad Vashem was being built. So back when I went to Israel and went to the archives to look up her maiden name, there was a name I did not recognize in all of my research, and it was a man named Richard. And Richard struck me as such an unusual name for someone in a family called Engel de Janisses. So mostly from Austria, and he was from Hungary. And then basically, as I found more out about Richard, that he was from Hungary, that she had this entire family from Hungary, I learned that her father lied to her and told her that she was the last Engel de Janissie in her family. So I applied for and received a Fulbright to teach at the University of Pécs, which is where all of her Hungarian ancestors lived and where Richard lived. And basically, when I found out about Richard, the archivist said to me, "You're the first person to ever ask about this man. There are three facts we know about him: where he lived, where he died, Mauthausen concentration camp. You must honor him to remember him." So basically, I thought, no, I don't need to do this. I can't do this. I don't know German. I don't know Hungarian. But when I applied for the Fulbright and got it, and things started aligning, the University of Pécs was looking for someone who could teach Southern American literature, and there I was from Mississippi. The universe started working in incredible ways, and so I thought this was going to be a story about Richard. I had no intention of writing about myself. To me, this was not a memoir. If anything, it was going to be a memoir about him. And for a while, I thought it was going to be a novel because I didn't think that I could write well enough I didn't think I would be able to uncover so many facts.
Yeah.
But then when Viktor Orban, the prime minister in Hungary, got elected, and we started seeing swastikas pop up everywhere we went, and graffiti that said things like "boil soap out of Jews" in my great-grandfather's synagogue, I suddenly became, I think, a part of the story, and this became more of a political book too. And I felt an urgency to write about Richard and the rest of the family who were murdered. So
I find it fascinating. Both of you said you didn't expect to start writing about this about yourselves. I find that fascinating because I certainly did. I said, this is all about me. No, not really. But I said, you know, it's going to be about, this is going to be memoir. I want to ask Richard to get involved. So tell us a little bit about your book. And did you jump into this saying this is going to be a memoir?
Well, actually, yes. But it took 22 years from the time I thought of the title, Whiskey Breakfast, which I had hoped and prayed nobody would take as a title, and they didn't. From the time that creation of that title in 1989, it took until 2011 before I could get it published. It's a book that extends from anger to reflection to redemption in many ways. It's a multi-generational saga. What the University of Minnesota Press liked about it was that they received so few manuscripts about the Scandinavian, the personal life of Scandinavians who've come to the United States. And in Chicago, the Swedes and the Norwegians are probably the least reported, least covered ethnic group in the city. They were a very quiet presence in the larger story of Chicago, and there were no notable corrupt politicians or anything, well, except one, Fred the Poor Swede Lundin in the 1920s, but he's another story. The story is about my family, and I guess the first thing I want to say, it's a very unusual family. To give you an idea, I was born in 1953. My father was born in 1897. He was 56 when I was born, and his father was born in 1858. So nearly 100 years passed separating one generation. My father was an angry revolutionist in Sweden at a time when the monarchy was supreme and you didn't really have a middle class. Sweden became the first country in the world to have a peaceful transition from a monarchy to a socialist government, and that happened in 1920 under Prime Minister Hjalmar Branting. My father grew up in the peasant regions of Sweden. He was active in the trade unionist movement, very far left in his thinking, and essentially was an atheist. His father was settled in the Dakotas in the 1880s and was a scout for the Hudson Bay Company, and he was active at the time that Sitting Bull was leading various Native American wars in the frontier. And he came back to Sweden and had 11 children, recklessly submerged them into lives of poverty and want. My father ran away from home. He became a revolutionary. He left Sweden in 1924 when he was 27 years of age. And this is where the family secret came in, which is what I discovered after my father's death in 1986. He always claimed the high moral upper ground, that he was a conscientious objector against the Swedish military, and conscription was mandatory for every young man. He was anti-monarchist and didn't believe that he could live in a country like Sweden at that time, which was evolving. But as it turned out, that his political principles really subordinated to the fact that he had sired 2 children with 2 different women, and he was married to neither, and the authorities were after him to take care of these 2 women. He came in through Montreal illegally, settled in Chicago, pretty much abandoned his political principles, and over the next 30 years became a very successful builder of suburban homes up along the North Shore. He lived in Skokie and was participated in all the Swedish fraternal organizations. So he exchanged his blue-collar identity for a white-collar identity. He was married 4 times. My mother was the third of his 4 wives. My half-brother was put in an orphanage when he was 4 years old, and he married my mother essentially for a housekeeper to raise his older son. This is not a book of warm, fuzzy nostalgia. It's a story of a lot of acrimony and bitterness toward him that I had to overcome. And there's different segments to it. The first part deals with the early family, but by the end of the book, the story evolves into my growing up under these circumstances, and I was raised by my mother and grandmother in the Norwood Park section of Chicago on the far northwest side, probably the area of Chicago nobody knows anything about because it's up there near O'Hare, and it's kind of like an isolated little suburb within a suburb. But within that framework, I rarely saw my father. He really had no time or interest, and the only dealings I had with him were on those infrequent custody visits when my mother would tell me to please ask my father for the alimony check because otherwise we couldn't live. And it was quite likely if she didn't get money, although she was working a full-time job, that I would end up in an orphanage. And because of the great age difference between my father and I, we had very little to say to one another. It wasn't until I grew up and into my 20s and 30s that I made an effort to try to understand his side of the story and to get his point of view. The third part of the story is a subject that really cuts close to home for me, and that's the whole issue of peer abuse in grammar schools and in high schools. Because in addition to my family struggles, I suffered through 8 years of being bullied by my classmates in the neighborhood, quite likely because I had foreign parents. We didn't have money, we didn't have a car, and the humiliation of going on Thursday, and it's a very affluent area in Norwood Park, and the humiliation of going to the store on Thursdays and being the only kid in the block who had to pull a wagon full of groceries home from the Jewel food store, it led to all kinds of issues and problems, and one of the redemptive things about this memoir, from my personal point of view, is the fact that after it was out and it had got some excellent reviews and it won 2 awards, were the number of letters I received from parents of children who've been bullied in school, viciously and tormented through grammar school, and they read my account of it and they wanted to know what can I do to get my son or daughter to make them realize that there's more to life. And it was a neglected, I call it the most neglected form of child abuse. And it really hasn't been until maybe the 1990s that this began to get proper attention. Parents of bullies would, of course, be in denial. Oh, my son's a good boy. He wouldn't do something like that. It wasn't in the teacher's pay grade to deal with it in the class. So you pretty much had to fight your own battle on your own terms. And the outpouring of letters that I received in response to this was gratifying. Some of it was very heartbreaking. And the one thing I would tell the parents was that to impress upon their children that this is a passing phase of your life, that the child must find his own anchor in his interests. And with me, it was history, baseball, to a lesser extent politics. And I knew one thing at the age of 11 as I was reading my Classics Illustrated comic books. In those days, teachers used to give you a failing grade if you did a book report off of Classics Illustrated. And recently I told a teacher, said, I would love if my kids read a Classics Illustrated. But I transported myself to a world of swashbuckling pirates and Civil War heroes, and it was anchored in reading and politics, and I've written books about Chicago politics, corruption, crime, and I work for the city of Chicago, so I guess what comes around goes around.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating how all 3 of you have such, well, it's part of the memoir issue, right? It's like it's very deep. These roots go down farther than you probably even knew they were going at the time you started to do research, and probably the same for you. But yet, the stories are extremely personal. So I'm wondering, why then? Why tell your story? Why is, to be very kind of gruff about this, why is your personal story so interesting to pass along to somebody else? See what I mean? It's like, why is that? I'm sure there are people out here thinking about memoir going, well, my story's, kind of interesting, but I don't know, does other people really want to know about this? Why? Why do we think it's important to do that? Anybody?
Well, I guess I was kind of talking about that. For me, I also wanted to touch on why, okay, so if you write your memoir, why publish it?
Why get it out there?
Why even
Right.
get it out there?
Difficult issues, difficult things about someone's life.
Right. So, my background is really education. And when I first started writing my book, it was in the mid-1980s, and there was all sorts of bad stuff happening in Poland with the Solidarity movement and the martial law. And really, I heard about communism the whole time I was growing up, and most Americans really didn't understand what that was really about in terms of living through it. So as an educator, I wanted to bring that story, and then bring the stories that were not told that I mentioned earlier. And I really was very compelled to getting it out there. I was almost possessed with it, maybe crazy. When I would tell people about it, they would say it would be a great thing, and maybe I would even become a writer someday as a career. And then really for my children too, because I didn't really want to burden my children when they were growing up with what happened to their grandparents during the war. So I didn't really even talk to them about that, and my parents were already older. They were older too when I was born, so there wasn't that passage of history, and I almost went out of my way not to talk about what happened during World War II with them. So I felt at some point I should provide something like that.
It was time.
It was time.
It was time. And I think what you said, Richard, too, was that you were almost a little bit validated by your story. Your story was validated by the information that you got from other people.
Well, it's
Would
true.
you say that?
Yeah. I use the word redemptive because I started writing the book out of anger for a neglectful father and for a group of kids I grew up with who thought I was never going to amount to anything. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like a spur in your side to excel. And I think one of the things that victims of peer abuse do is that they motivate themselves that much harder, and very often they become workaholics and people pleasers, and they do this to not only prove to the world that they have some value and can accomplish things, but also to convince themselves of that. I was enormously angered with my father when he died in 1986, and I sifted through a stack of letters written in Swedish that I had translated by my cousins in Sweden, and it revealed this whole sordid tale. And coupling my brother's story together with all of the anger he felt, he was my half-brother, and he lived with my father, and he was physically beaten by him a number of times. And this whole ball of anger welling within me drained for over 20 years until finally I found a publisher. And by the time I finished it, I took a sigh of relief and I said, that's done, and I think I finally come to terms with it. If it's an unfortunate story, it's a question of coming to terms with it. You do it because you have to do it, and it's in you. You have the motivation and the drive. And the stories these two authors tell are equally compelling.
Yeah, it's like they were compelled to do it. I mean, you said that, Margaret, about like you got this information at first, you're like, I don't know, do I want to go there? And then you were compelled, right?
Yeah. And I think one thing, too, about memoir that's good to know, and to me it's freeing, is that it's, memory is in the word memoir, and it's very much your own story, your own telling. It's not an autobiography. A memoir is a spotlight on a time that to you changed everything. And I think that I have little notes, around in my office to remind me like what I'm doing, which I find depressingly helpful. Depressingly just because it's like I've got to remind myself. But when you kind of come to that, when you come to that, I'm writing about something that changed everything for me, and maybe for my son, who's also in the book, and maybe for my husband. And so when you think big like that, then definitely, you'll be possessed and driven to write it because it changed everything. And the more specific you get about your own memories, strangely, that's universal. You would think it would be the other way around, but it's not. I mean, the memoirs that I love the most aren't just personal and revelatory, but also they're very specific about a person and his or her memory. And sometimes it's not trauma or any of that.
Yeah, sometimes it's not trauma.
Yeah.
I had a publisher one time who used to call them dysfunctional memoirs. Not that they were bad memoirs dysfunctionally, but they were about something that was terribly dysfunctional.
Yeah.
But yet that doesn't necessarily have to be that sort of approach. I mean, I was thinking, I was talking to some folks out in the vestibule there about, Patti Smith wrote a book called The Year of the Monkey, and it's about 1 year. And yes, there were some difficult things that went on in that year, but it's 1 year of her life. One of my books is about a weekend that was transformative. So, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's either fantastical, like I climbed Mount Everest, or swam the Nile.
Kind of like the idea of you clowning Mount Everest.
Well, clowning Mount Everest might actually be a whole different book. But it doesn't have to be fantastical. It doesn't necessarily have to be a really deep, ugly issue either. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes people think it has to be. I don't think it does. But that sense of humanity, that connectiveness, that universality that we have. I mean, I read a quote before you arrived about how what Waldo Emerson said, that it connects us to the rest of humanity. By doing so, it turns our small personal sorrows or triumphs or longings into art. So in a way, that's kind of what it is. But being very personal is important. You're a character in your stories, right? I mean, for a memoir to work, you're a character.
You have to do a period of self-examination when you write a book of this nature, especially involving people who are alive, because you have to weigh their feelings about what you may write, and you also have to be perfectly honest with yourself in what you wish to divulge versus what you want to keep hidden. And I think that is the greatest issue with doing memoir or even autobiography, is coming to terms with yourself and with other people who are influential in your life. And I admit, I had to self-censor some things I wanted to say about some people in my life when I wrote that book, and because I didn't want to hurt them. But of course, when the main characters are deceased, it makes it much easier.
Right. Yeah, it does.
But I think that is probably the greatest issue in trying to do this kind of work.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, both of you? Did you find places within your stories where you had to feel like you had to censor yourself a little bit?
Well, I would like to quote my friend Wesley again. He would say things like, I had to put myself on like a psychiatrist's couch and try to remember. And that kind of was what happened with me. I mean, when I came to the realization that I really had to incorporate parallel stories from my life that would reflect on my mother's, the impact that her life had on me, I really physically took myself out of the state to a place where I went to Arizona for half a year, and just to get away from all the distractions. And luckily, I was able to do that, and just really dig deep into really risky kind of things to say, and but I felt like her story was so profound and it affected me so profoundly that I had to bring myself into it. But it was hard.
Definitely things that I couldn't write about until people were deceased. Not because I was afraid of their being upset, but me personally, I just had to somehow let it have time. I couldn't write about my sister who was an alcoholic, and I couldn't write about my sister and her death until after she was gone. Then it started to come. The realizations started to make sense to me, but it didn't do that at the time. Would you say, did you censor anything? Did you feel like you held back?
I guess I kind of had the opposite dilemmas because I was writing about the dead and trying to bring them back to life, and I was trying to track down any living witnesses, eyewitnesses of arrests or what happened to Richard in Mount House and exactly. So I went through this period of interviewing people, and so I wanted I was so careful about being careful that I sent all the manuscript to every person I spoke with to make sure that the Hungarian or the German was right, because I didn't want to mess up, because this is important stuff not to mess up. But that said, I found my mother's first cousin who survived the Nazis and the Soviet occupation, and that was just a little miracle in the book. And survivors are difficult people. And even though she's so much like my mother, she held on to her information because it was all she had. And who was I, this little American coming over, snooping around her family? And how could I prove that I really was a relative of hers? So it took a long time to be with her, and I was, that was I don't know, kind of a journalism exercise, really.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, because I think sometimes memoir can be a small J journalism, not necessarily big J journalism, because that's journalism, right? But there's small J research, that's involved. But yet sometimes that journalism is the examination of yourself than necessarily examination of a fact or a place or someone else. And I think that's part of it. At least it was for me a lot of times. And I'm a journalist. That's my background. So sometimes it's hard to write things that are made up. I'm supposed to write the truth most of the time, or at least my truth. So, but you found, it sounds to me, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me as you found little tidbits, that made you go, oh, wait a minute, more, please more, please more. Yeah.
Oh,
Instead
I got
of censoring,
greedy.
it was more.
It was totally greed, and they recognize greed in Europe, and it doesn't go well. So it was a strange exercise in diplomacy and journalism and ethics, and there's a part of a scene in the book where I could have, I wrote it in the first draft, and I could have included it, but I don't think it would have done anybody any good, in the end. And so when we do those wonderful edits, to me, I love to edit, because that's when you're really getting.
That's when you're really shaping
into it. You're really shaping it. That's right. It wasn't moving the plot towards Richard, So that was one of the first things I got rid of.
You mentioned the process of journaling and journalism. I'm a self-taught writer. I took some writing courses, but I never majored in it. I never went to any workshops or anything like that. I like to say I write by ear. If it sounds good, I write it. But with that said, I began keeping a journal on January 1st, 1965, and it's a process I still continue. I think Albert Ellis holds the world's record for longevity in a diary, but I think I'm probably pushing that record now. But that account was a timeline and a thread that helped me become a writer in terms of structuring plot and doing research and so on. And the other point you had spoken to was what other people may think of it when you share with them excerpts of it. My greatest disappointment with Whiskey Breakfast, and one that still deeply troubles me today, my brother died 3 years ago, and he was kind of an outlaw, 1950s kind of greaser who got in trouble with the law, and he was a black leather jacket kind of kid, and he was 10 years older than me. And he was always the bad boy and was always excoriated by my father, and he was a hoodlum, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, I tried to build him up and tell his side of the story, how this little boy was put in an orphanage at age 4 and then had to grow up tough and mean because his father was tough and mean. But the greatest disappointment is that he never read the book. And I had my book party at the Swedish Museum in 2011, and the greatest disappointment there was he didn't even pick up the book, and I literally had to give the book to his wife because he just didn't want it. He was there, he showed up, but said nothing and was glum and sullen through the whole thing.
Too painful?
I don't know. He didn't read it. I think it was a lot of self-anger that he had within him. But I had really written that book. The secondary part of that book was trying to vindicate him to the eyes of the world that thought and he always had that self-image of him being a loser, and I tried to elevate him from that. And the worst disappointment was he never read the book.
Yeah, my story is not quite like that, but I've written 5 memoirs, so wow. 5 different parts of my life, really. So I've had, my kids have been in some of them, my ex-wife was in some of them, my current wife is in some of them. And I've always I always have had them read the manuscript. I have a good enough relationship with my ex-wife that wasn't a problem. Although when I wrote my first book, Accidental Lessons, which is about a time that I taught in a troubled school, she's in the book, part of the book, and she says, I'm good with this, but if it becomes a movie, Susan Sarandon plays me. So I have that going for me. So there are moments that I felt like I needed to offer this up, and I can imagine that must be painful for you because here you are trying to help your brother, and he doesn't want to accept it in a way, which probably was part of his personality in a way, right?
He's a tough guy.
Yeah. So what about how? I know there's some people here who must be thinking, okay, I have something to say. I don't know where to start, how to begin, what do I do? How in the world do I tell this story? We heard Donna say, and even Richard to some extent say, I'm not a trained writer. I didn't come from that world. So how do you do that? Where do you begin? How do you start? If you feel like you have this story, and sometimes we don't even know we have the story till we tell it to somebody, and then they look at you and go, how many times has this happened? You've told a story at a party and someone said, you need to write about that, right? I'm wondering how they begin. How do you start? Tough question, isn't it?
Well, I started very chronologically. My mother would tell stories, she would tell one story here, one story there. They were connected in time and space. And finally, I think when I became a mother, she, I think, recognized that I could finally understand her story, her journey. And she agreed to have me interview her. And my father was very helpful with that because he sat her down and okay, where are we in time here? What year is it? Where are you? And it was, very helpful for me to be able to, write the story, the World War II part of the story. What I ended up, having when I had that full draft, and I actually was at the University of Chicago's writing program. They pretty much convinced me. I had to put myself into it, and that was when I came to a screeching halt because I'm like, oh no, I have to write about myself here. And so it, as I was mentioning before, it's like putting yourself on a psychiatrist's couch, and you have to, dig deep and find those vignettes of, parallel stories. And so, you have to have this willingness to take these risks that, take you places where maybe you don't want to go. Basically, it's an inquiry into into the question of who am I? And all of a sudden you just who was I as a mother? Oh my gosh, talk about guilt trips, and motherhood.
You can't be afraid to go, like I tell my students sometimes, you can't be afraid to go deep.
Right.
Because the reader will catch it. They'll know, you're not telling the whole story. There's something about that. They can tell if you don't go deep. You have to be willing to do that.
You have to be very authentic. You have to establish an authentic voice and as the narrator. So I was, can I go through?
Absolutely. You want to talk a little?
Okay,
then we can ask Margaret.
So going back to, how, in my case, the World War II story, and then it's like, well, what about that World War II story? So I had to, we were kind of talking about this earlier, you have to separate yourself as the writer from yourself as the protagonist. So it's a process. It took me over 30 years, but there were big gaps of time where I wasn't working on the book at all, but it was always this nagging thing that I just had to get done. So that's, kind of, and here's a couple of examples I can give you. So the situation in my book, where my sister's 5 years old and she's my half-sister, is deported with our mother to Siberia, to a labor camp, and the story about, so that's the thing that happened, and then what about that story? So it's my mother's reaction to it, it's Mira's, recollection of things, and she really did not want to talk about a lot of this stuff. I had to drag stuff out of her. And, the attachment that she grew to our mother, which I didn't have. And the similar situation from my part of it is, here I am, I'm 5-year-old, and I'm trying to be, a normal American kid, and I'm running, meeting up with my mother. I see my mother in her bedroom, and she's talking to herself into a mirror and saying these horrible things that scared me. So it really kind of was a detachment. So that was my part of it, which, I had to kind of drag that out of my history.
Right.
Here's another example. My sister's, she almost died many times in that whole turmoil. They were there for like 2 years, and later on in life, she had a total mental breakdown. So the story is, in that situation, is my mother's attempts to save her, and, and not only as a child, but also as an adult. And the parallel story in my situation is my son's cancer, very serious cancer, and his mental breakdown. And so how was I, dealing with that and having these misgivings of, my being a parent, a mother. So that's, a couple of examples there. I like Vivian Gornick's, her own memoir, Fierce Attachments. I really identify with this quote of hers: I could not leave my mother because I had become my mother.
Yeah. I wrote a whole book about whether I became my father's father, or if I become that person. It scared the living daylights out of me. Margaret, do you, when you come from a different background, you've written fiction, you've written many other books, so this started out to be something that was fiction. So, how did you switch gears?
Well, I did go into the story when I went to Hungary with my husband and 15-year-old son. I thought I will collect enough information about Richard to write his novel, to write his story in a novel form, because there's no way I can get enough information about this person who, is already long gone. So as I researched and gathered material, I could just, my box was growing. What I do is I just dump stuff into a box that I get from Home Depot. This is my very organized method. But I say menus, everything I just put in this box, and until it starts coming to me. But Richard did not come to me in any form, any fictional form, and I didn't feel in the end that was the right story, the right way to tell his story, because his story is fact, and it became increasingly clear to me that the facts were so important. So I tried to write this whole story in second person.
Oh, that hurts.
That's what my husband said when he read it. So I liked it it was a good exercise because it organized his life for me, and the main beats, like you do. What's the situation? What are the main beats in the story? Hemingway never started a novel without 7 to 14 really important scenes. And so I used all those kind of fictional techniques to try to figure out the shape of this story. And then news started happening, and I started getting angry. The immigration crisis. Viktor Orban was tweeting his respect and adoration to our incumbent president. I'm sorry to bring this all up, but when I get angry, I write an essay, And in fiction, if I have got a little story to kind of sort of try it out, I try it out in a short story and see if it's a novel. So with this, I just started writing a series of essays for the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and USA Today. And I got so many hate emails that I thought, oh, well, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a winner.
Yeah, it's like I'm pressing somebody's bruise. Let's try a little harder. So then that's when I realized what the shape was going to be. And when you were talking about authority, the voice, and that I was in it, it just started all forming from those essays. So I kind of knew, and I had some healthy anger, that was to me very useful.
Yeah, you really have to feel strongly about what you're having to say. And you mentioned something, too, about using fiction, using the craft of fiction to write memoir, dialogue, scenes, all those kinds of things. I always tell people, start with a scene. Don't start with, I was born in New York in 1936. But you start with a scene like that Christmas where, my sister left angry for whatever reason. I mean, some scene is a good place to get started. And it doesn't have to be necessarily chronological. You can figure that out later on, but scene by scene. Yeah.
Sometimes you have to use fiction in these stories because obviously you weren't around to see something happen or hear actual dialogue. And as much as you try to stay true to the story, it's like bricks without mortar. You have the bricks and the fundamental knowledge, but you don't have the dialogue or you don't have the setting. And sometimes you have to employ this technique. In the realm of nonfiction, we're seeing a lot of what they call literary nonfiction nowadays. I think one of the biographies of Ronald Reagan introduced this, where there's invented dialogue and invented characters. And unfortunately, unless the memoir is going to be a very dry kind of thing, you really need to spice it a little bit. And you have to imagine sometimes what was being said between people.
Yeah, I don't remember a conversation I had when I was 6 with my mother, but I remember the essence of the conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can do that, in a truthful way, but, you can show your hand. I don't remember the specifics.
Sure.
I don't remember what we said, but I know that she was drinking tea. I know that, I remember perhaps she said this. I mean, I lean on maybes and perhaps a lot.
Yeah, that's a really good thing.
And it also starts with, I think, inspiration and spark, I think, are the key things. You don't, maybe some memoirs drift into their subject matter, but more often than not, the moment hits you that you're going to do this. For me, it happened when my father was alive in 1978. I had just published my first book. I was 25 years old, and he was the first person I took the book to show, expecting a pat on the back, some praise. Wow, my son at 25 published a book. He was watching PBS. I brought it in. I showed it to him. He looked at it like that from afar, tossed it on the table, and said, "So how much are you going to make out of this?" And that was it. Didn't even open it up, didn't even look at a page, never read it. And then the rejoinder to that was, he says to me, "Well, son, when are you going to write a book about me?" Meaning him.
Wow.
And,
how prophetic.
Yeah, and I thought to myself, okay, you bastard, I will write a book about you someday.
Wow, that's great.
True story. Story.
That's great.
Yep.
Greg, I don't know where you are, but can we do some questions for the audience? That would be great. I want to leave some time. Do we have a mic down there, or can we offer up a mic, or can you yell a little bit, or how do you want to do that? Probably start with raising hands, huh? Yeah, we'll try to do the best we can. Okay. Hands, please. Yes.
Hi, this is for Donna. You mentioned some scenes and situations where there was some parallel between your mother's story and your story. How did you structure them when you were writing the book? I mean, were they juxtaposed in the text, or were they, chapters apart?
Basically alternating chapters, which turned out to be very successful. A lot of people liked that. The World War II story is very heavy and very hard to read. And so by interjecting my part of the story, it provided some relief. I mean, it had parallel kind of stories, as I was mentioning about my son's cancer and his mental breakdown. But there were other things that were a little lighter than that. I actually did the World War II part as in creative nonfiction, which is what Rich was just talking about. So that's in third person, and then my part of the story is in first person. And so it's distinguished that way, and it's been received really well that I did it that way.
Thank you. You have a question down here, sir?
Hello.
Yeah.
Mr. Lindbergh once said something that I remember. He said, if you think writing a book is hard, try getting one published. So
Yes.
each of the four of you, briefly, did you have difficulty getting published, a memoir published?
I always have difficulty getting published. I don't have an agent at the moment. The agents I've had have not been good. I can generally publish with university presses. They accept unagented material. It took me 22 years to publish Whiskey Breakfast, but I never gave up. I got a flood of rejections from New York. It was, they give you, the old excuse coming out of New York houses is that too regional. In other words, if you're not writing about something in either New York or LA, it's regional, and it's the flyover zone. It doesn't matter. It doesn't count. I think I can paper my walls with rejections for book ideas about stories in Chicago that New York editors don't want. So yeah, it's a constant struggle, and it's impossible sometimes.
Rejection is part of the deal. First book for me had 30-some rejections. And I had an agent at the time, and the agent said, "You're getting the best rejections I've ever seen." Meaning they were good, like, "Oh, this is really good, but we're not going to take it because we already wrote a story about teachers, or we already published a story about a road trip." Or there were other reasons, usually, at least for me. Then I started to get a little more. Then I have a publisher who's published 2 books of mine, another publisher who's published 2. It started to become a little bit easier, but it's never easy. I don't care what anybody says. It's never easy.
Well, and I think too that it depends on what the market is. I mean, publishers, will publish. You could have the greatest story on the planet, but if it's not something anybody really wants to read at that particular moment,
That time, sure.
I mean, yeah, I went through the same thing. I mean, the first draft of my book, which was not a memoir, was just the World War II story. I had an agent for a while, and it was rejection letter after rejection letter. And then, of course, if you want to publish with any of the big 5, you have to have an agent. They're not even going to, forget it. You're just wasting your time. But it just takes some research. And what ended up finally happening for me was I was doing some research as to what these publishers wanted, and I turned out that the University of Wisconsin Press was looking for stories like mine. So I kind of, lucked out, but it was a lot of, research and time and effort, and there's your writer's hat, and then there's the marketing hat you have to wear, and if you're not willing to do that, it's very hard to get published.
When vampires were really a big deal in the books, I had an agent say to me, "Just throw some vampires in there." Somebody will. That'll work out.
Everything is seasonal.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I remember I had a writing colleague, a woman who survived Bergen-Belsen, and she wrote her memoir of it and couldn't get it accepted anywhere. So I asked her why, and one of the New York editors had told her, "We just have too many Holocaust books out there right now," and this was in the 80s. So some subjects have a good cachet for a while, and then they fade away. And it really is, as you say, with vampires, it's the same kind of thing. When a subject is hot, you see a lot of books out about it, and then things change.
Margaret, you've got to have a bit of a different story since you've written some other books that have been successful.
Well, the Holocaust line was what I got, and this was my first memoir. So I think some of the editors were reluctantly looking at me like, "What do you know about any of this?" So.
You got a musical background, apparently.
Okay. I know that song. No one wants me to sing it. But You know, my former editor who had published In My Mother's House, and she had been at St. Martin's, and now she was at Simon Schuster, and she had me come to New York to talk about this book, Where the Angels Live. So I thought, oh, this is great. She had me come to her office so she could say no.
Wow.
And it was, and I told a friend of mine that, and he said, oh, that's just so nice. I said, no, that is so not nice.
That's not nice.
That was just awful. But, you know, my mother is 90, and she wanted this book out while she was still alive. And I had a great experience with Calypso Editions, which is a small press, and they're terrific editors. They're all like Fulbrighters, and they know, you know, different languages, so I knew that they would do a really great job with the copy editing. So I just felt like it was, you know, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to just go to them. And,
It's like searching on, you know, like a dating service, trying to find the publisher.
And I was anxious because I did want the book out, but it's the big publishers. The scene is just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, there are so many unbelievable mid-list and small presses that are
Fantastic.
popping up and just scooping up all these wonderful stories and
But
books.
they don't get the attention in the media. That's the problem.
That is.
There's fewer and fewer review outlets.
Yep.
I remember having a conversation with Elizabeth Taylor, the editor of the Tribune, not the former actress, and she told me, she says, you know, I would love to review all these great books that are coming out about Chicago, but can you get me a full page of advertisements to go with it? And that basically said it all. In other words, get us advertising and we'll review books, because they review off the New York Times best-selling list,
Yeah, that
and
happens.
that's it.
Well, I had an experience where I had a small publisher wanted to publish my book, and I actually turned them down because they weren't going to do a very big run, and they were going to charge, I think it wasn't even a hardcover, they were going to charge $40 for a copy, and I'm thinking, who's going to buy a $40 book?
Is that a library publisher?
No, it was McFarland. They're a small.
Well, yeah, well, they're a library
Oh,
publisher.
are they? Okay.
They jack up prices for books, and they sell exclusively to libraries.
Okay, so
Stay away from library publishers, people, if you have.
Yeah, so I actually turned them down, you know, which was a very brave thing to do.
Yeah, especially when you're out there with your first book.
Yeah, with my first book.
I've had that too,
Yeah.
where I've turned away a couple, but you know, to answer your question, it's not an easy road, especially now.
Well, you know, there is also the option of self-publishing.
There is,
And,
yes.
you know, and there's hybrid publishers out there. I almost went with She Writes Press because they do vet your book
They do
out.
good work too.
And they do very nice job, and it's not astronomically expensive, and you can buy as little or as much of their service as you want, but you still get paid on the back end.
Yeah, there's a side of publishing now that has opened up the gates. You've broken down some of the gates that were there, the gatekeeping, which I think is a good thing. But yet that also, you don't know what's coming through the gate sometime, to keep the metaphor going here. So that becomes a little bit of a problem. But I've also found that with the big publishers, at least from my experience, the big five publishers that people always talk about, they don't want to take a risk. They used to take risks.
They don't anymore.
They don't anymore. They want a sure thing.
30,000
yeah.
copies is usually their threshold.
Right, and it just, they won't take a risk. So I'm sorry, back here we have a gentleman, somebody up back there.
Yes, my name is Janet. How do you write a book proposal or even write, period, to be taken seriously about an unbelievable or controversial, illogical subject matter like UFO abduction or occultic matter that's not mainstream topics without be discounted or just viewed as plain weird or deranged as a writer?
Identify a non-traditional publisher. The way to do that is to look at Publishers Weekly. There's a big journal book that has all the publishers from A to Z, and it lists their areas of interest. So in the fantasy, sci-fi, and occult areas, there's lots of publishers that exclusively look at that, and those are the publishers you should identify for a book that's non-traditional.
Yeah, because you could really waste your time putting proposals out to publishers that don't do what you're trying to do. They don't publish that kind of book. That could be a real waste of time. So, and there are a lot of mid-range or smaller publishers that have a very keen focus. And if you can find a few of those for your subject matter.
Literary Marketplace, is the name of the book you should look at. It's
sure.
in the libraries.
Yeah.
Hey, my question is, for several of you, it's taking like a good amount of time, you know, a few decades, a lifetime, almost, at least my lifetime, to publish some work. My question is, how much did your work change between the time that you had a first draft and you wanted to have it published and you were, you know, trying to find publishers? Like, how much did the work change between that time? And because I understand trying to have to sort of maybe pivot to publishing houses that might accept the work or reject the work. I'm thinking about that right now.
You know, for me, it was about whether I wanted to make the change. Sometimes I would hold back and say, no, I don't want it to be that. I want it to be this, so I'll keep looking. But I'll tell you about one real briefly, and then others can certainly jump in. One book of mine was a series of essays about fathers and sons, and it was all factual, and it was basically essays. And my editor and my agent loved the book, but said, I can't get this published because at the time you're not Bill Cosby, who was the big father guy at the time, right? How ironically. But you're not Bill Cosby, so I can't get this published in the right way. But there's one story in there about a road trip. Maybe you could take that road trip, expand on the road trip, and intertwine the stories that you've written on the essays about fatherhood into that larger road trip. And that's what became the book. So I took an entire time when I was at the writer's residence at the Kerouac House in Orlando. I spent 3 months reworking those essays into a theme based on that one essay. So it changed a lot. And right after that, I found a publisher like that by those changes. So it was really, it needed to be changed to find the right publisher.
So I'm afraid we're out of time. We've already extended our stay a little bit. So I want to thank David for doing such a great job moderating and all the panelists. And to show you our gratitude, you all get a free 1-year membership in the Midland Authors. And the mug in front of you on the table, the Midland Authors mug, you can take that home with you and remember this evening. So if you want to learn more about Midland Authors, go to midlandauthors.com or sign up on that email mailing list, and we'll keep you informed of upcoming events. So thank you again.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, Dave.